Hey there, AP Stat students. We're going to take a look at experiments today. We've got several videos here that we're going to look at, but we're going to get started. Talk about what's the difference between response bias and voluntary response. They're not the same thing. A voluntary response sample is when you just take volunteers. You just go around and ask people questions. They are volunteering. There's no randomness to that in terms of random assignment and random selection. Response bias is when a person has been randomly selected. They are part of the study group and they choose not to respond. That's non-response. So there is a difference between voluntary response and non-response. Here it's written as response bias, but typically we call it non-response. So we do need to be aware it is a common mistake that students think that if somebody doesn't respond, that is voluntary response. Voluntary response is not the same as non-response. So something just to be clear on, because that is an AP question that can be asked. So what's the difference between an observational study and an experiment? Well, an experiment imposes a treatment. You are giving them something. There is a condition that is applied to somebody or something that you're imposing. Observational study, you're just observing. You're not really you're not influencing, you're not changing settings on a computer or a cell phone or adding water to grass or plants or anything like that. When we do an experiment is to see if we can get cause and effect, causation. That's the concept. We would like to be able to do cause and effect, but sometimes we can't. Confounding is when we have another variable that's present. Two variables are causing effect on the response variable. So there's two explanatory variables. There are two x's that are causing the y to change. The example, we could think about grass growing or a plant growing. Definitely the growth of the plant is the response. A variable is the amount of water it gets. So you might say, well, the more water a plant gets, the more it's going to grow. And that can definitely be true. But there's some other variables. How about the amount of sunlight it gets? How about the amount of nutrients? Did you put Miracle-Gro in the soil? The type of soil that it's growing in, the time of year it is, will determine how much that plant grows. Typically, plants grow more in the spring and in the fall. So if you're watering a plant in the middle of winter, it's probably not, the amount of water isn't making the plant grow at that point. So we have other variables, and that's called confounding. One of the tips in terms of being in the AP test, you can't just identify what the variable is that's confounding or another variable that's contributing to it. You have to explain how it's interacting and which direction it would make it go. So if another confounding variable is sunlight, well, the more sunlight a plant gets, the more it's going to grow. To a point. If it gets too much sunlight, then it might not be a good thing. But that's another variable that they're gonna want it more specifically, and not just too much sunlight or sunlight. They want it to be explained. So we just have to be aware of that. Okay, we're gonna pause here. Is this an observational study and an experiment? So check your understanding. Looking at this, was a treatment imposed on this? So was a treatment imposed, or was it an observational study? A treatment was imposed. This is an experiment. They changed the settings on the laptops. It's not like they're giving them blood pressure medication to like a patient. That's also an experiment. But this is an experiment because they weren't just simply observing. They imposed a treatment. So you need to be aware of the two differences there. Okay. So we'll go ahead and pause here for a second so you can read this. If you need to pause the video, you may also do that. This is an observational study. There was no random assignment to a particular number of meals with the family. So this is an observational study. The explanatory variable in number 3 is the number of meals per week eaten with their family. And then the response is GPA. So we can't establish a cause and effect relationship. This is an experiment, so it's a lot harder to do cause and effect when it's not an experiment. That's a big thing. There's a lot of other confounding variables here that could contribute to the response that you're getting from the explanatory variable to the response variable. One of those could be students who have part-time jobs, may not be able to eat with their families, and then they may not have much time to study, so then their grades could be lower. That's just one example. There's a lot of different other examples that could possibly be used, but confounding variables definitely are going to make it more difficult to do cause and effect relationships. So here's just some vocabulary. Treatment is what you're imposing to see if X and Y are related, if there's a cause and effect. Experimental units are the collection of individuals. Individuals are usually, when we talk about humans, we call them subjects. So we want to perform good experiments. So there's effective ways for experimenting, just like there's effective ways to do sampling, so we need to make sure that we're doing that. Okay, so I'm not going to read that whole entire thing to you. Pause the screen and read it, or read it on your own separate notes. They're talking about the effectiveness of Career Start. So they recruited 14 middle schools in this particular county. So students at the schools used Career Start generally had better attendance and fewer discipline problems, earned higher test scores, reported greater engagement in their classes, and were more likely to graduate. So identify the experimental units and explanatory response variables and treatments in the Career Start experiment. So again, if you need to pause, please do so that you can think about it. So the experimental units are the subjects. Experimental units are the 14 middle schools in the North Carolina, Forsyth County, North Carolina. Again, when they're specific, you want to be specific. If it was just if it didn't have a name to the county, then we would just say 14 middle schools. We want to be specific. The explanatory variable is whether the school used Career Start with its students. Several response variables were measured. The test scores, attendance, behavior, student engagement, and graduation rates. So a lot of things have been measured there. Some of those are objective, some of them are subjective. We need to be aware of that. How do you measure student engagement? It's a little more subjective. The experiment compares 2 treatments: the standard middle school curriculum and then the standard curriculum plus the Career Start. So those are the 2 things that the treatments. So experiments, as I mentioned before, can give good evidence for causation. We can't always do an experiment. Sometimes it's not possible. Okay, go ahead and take a look, read through this. If you have to pause the video, please do so. But we're going to try to identify the experimental units or subjects. Subjects, again, talking about humans. In this case, I think we're talking about commercials, so we wouldn't be talking about subjects. Explanatory response variables, and then the treatments. So the subjects are the 100, I guess they are students. I'm sorry. There's 120 undergraduate students, so they are subjects. There's 2 explanatory variables: length of the commercial and number of repetitions. The response variable includes measures of subjects' recall of the ad, their attitudes about the digital camera, and whether they intended to purchase it. So, does advertising work or not? A lot of people do this kind of stuff. They measure people's responses to certain commercials and whether they should be used again or whether they should be scrapped. So this is somebody gets paid a lot of money to do this kind of stuff. So just to be aware of this. The 2 different lengths of commercials and then the different repetitions are all the different treatments. So, okay, this is an example of a bad experiment. Again, if you need to pause the video, please do so. A lot of times I can't pause and wait, but you can always pause it so that you can take a look and read through it. But basically, we have a group of students. They're going to take the online course, and then we're going to see if they increase their math scores. Kind of makes sense, right? It's a simple design, but there's some issues with this. What are some of the issues? Well, they're taking the online course, but the online course definitely helped. If you're taking other math classes, don't you think your other math classes may have helped? Sometimes that's one of the biggest things. Or just getting older. Sometimes students need to be older to understand algebra or calculus. So those are just some other confounding variables that we need to be aware of. Again, not saying that the online course is bad, but it's a lot harder to assess that. Education sometimes is very hard to do because you can't compare two students. They're not exactly the same. So for us to randomly assign students to take an online course and not take the online course, okay, we can do that, but still the students aren't the same. So that makes it more difficult. That's what it's talking about at the bottom. We're not in a lab. So it's more difficult to do experiments in the real world because there's a lot of issues. I think it says there's more varied conditions. So we just need to be aware of that and be aware of the confounding variables that could possibly exist. So we're going to pause there, and there'll be a second video and a third video for section 2. There's a lot of good information that we need to make sure we go through. So see you in a little bit.